And here we see the Missouri State animal, the spider, and he's sitting next to a 12 gauge 2 3/4 inch shell, just for perspective. Hi, we're out on a range today, and a while ago I did a presentation on the M1 carbine in caliber 30 US carbine. And part of that presentation was to compare the power of the M1 carbine to a rifle in caliber 357 Magnum. And that led to a lot of people contacting me asking to see a comparison of the power of 30 carbine and 357 Magnum in handguns. And that has been no easy task to put together. The only handgun I have in 30 carbine is this Ruger Blackhawk with a 7.5 inch barrel. So to make a fair comparison with 357 Magnum, we would ideally have a firearm of the same make and model with the same barrel length. And I was able to find this Ruger Blackhawk 357 Magnum with a 7.5 inch barrel. This kind of handgun with a 6.5 inch barrel is common. With a 7.5 inch barrel, I had to do some real searching to find that. Now another problem we have is that 30 carbine ammunition is almost exclusively 110 grain projectile. If there's any ammo in 30 carbine with a different projectile weight, I've never seen it. But to make a truly fair comparison with 357 Magnum, we'd want 357 ammo with 110 grain projectile. And that does exist, but it's not really what's most common. 357 Magnum can have 180 grain, 158 grain, 125 grain, and many other weights. So what would be the most fair comparison of ammunition might not be the most realistic. However, I have enough different types of ammunition in both calibers, I think we can make a comparison that's going to be pretty close to fair and pretty close to realistic. And of course, the comparison will start with some tedious chronograph analysis. Let's take a look. I have my chronograph set up at 7 yards, and it might be difficult for you to see, but there really is a big hillside back there. And I've got my Ruger Blackhawk caliber 30 carbine loaded with Remington UMC 30 carbine 110 grain full metal jacket round nose. $13.63. $15.04. $13.97. $14.55. $14.13. $13.94. I'm going to fire a couple more shots. $13.97. $14.57. And $14.13. Now let's see how that compares to what I would consider a realistic 357 Magnum analogy. Now I have my 357 Magnum revolver loaded with MagTech 357 Magnum 158 grain soft point flat nose. Now that might not seem like a fair comparison, but I consider it to be realistic because that UMC 30 carbine I was using is something I consider to be medium powered target ammunition. And this MagTech ammo, even though it is soft point, is still something I consider to be medium powered target ammunition. So let's see what kind of velocities we get. $13.04. $12.92. 1298, 1260, 1187, and 1284. Let's try another type of ammo. Now I'm back to my .30 carbine revolver, which I have loaded with Hornady Critical Defense 110 grain FTX projectile, like a ballistic tip. $14.34. $14.82. $15.06. $14.90. $13.76. $15.05. Again, when I get inconsistent readings like that, makes me want to shoot a couple more rounds. Let's just shoot 2 more rounds. $14.75. And $14.73. Now let's see if we can find a type of .357 Magnum ammo that's analogous to this. And now I have Hornady Critical Defense .357 Magnum 125 grain FTX projectile, like a ballistic tip. I consider this a very realistic comparison. $14.85. $14.45. $14.63. $15.36. $14.03. And $14.72. Now let's try one more type of ammo. Now let's compare some ammunition that I think will make a truly fair comparison, at least as close as I can get. And we'll start with Remington Green and Yellow Box .30 carbine 110 grain soft point. $15.34. $15.64. $16.49. $13.78. $15.93. And $16.08. And again, when I get readings as inconsistent as that, I want to shoot a couple more shots. And we seem to be getting more inconsistent readings with the .30 carbine than we are with the .357, and we'll talk about that more in a few minutes. $14.89. $15.15. and 1630. Now let's try some 357 ammo. And now I have Remington Green and Yellow Box 357 Magnum 110 grain semi-jacketed hollow point. That's about as fair as any comparison I'm going to be able to make. $15.64. $15.44. $15.18. $14.83. $14.97. And $15.09. And again, let's shoot a couple more rounds. $14.89. And $15.38. Now, let's go crunch the numbers. Well, I crunched the numbers, and here they are. And of course, it comes with the normal caveats that chronographs don't always agree with each other, and certain environmental factors like ambient temperature and elevation can affect chronograph results. And the results I got were, with our moderately powered target ammunition, with 30 carbine, we got a velocity of 1421, with 357 Magnum 1270. So the 30 carbine is ahead by 151 feet per second. That sounds like a lot more, but remember it's a 110 grain projectile versus the 357 Magnum having a 158 grain projectile. Now, when we make what I call a realistic comparison with our Hornady critical defense, with the 30 carbine we got 1467. With the 357 Magnum we got 1467. The exact same velocity. Remember though that our 30 carbine has a 110 grain projectile, our 357 Magnum has a 125 grain projectile. So that is a little more. So I computed the energy foot-pounds, and if I did my math right, with the 30 carbine we got energy foot-pounds of 525, with the 357 Magnum 597, 72 pounds more. And that sounds like it could be significantly more. But when we do what I consider to be truly a fair test, Remington Green and Yellow Box 110 grain versus Remington Green and Yellow Box 110 grain. With a 30 carbine, we got 1,551. With the 357 Magnum, 1,530. A difference of 21 feet per second. That's well within the variation of one round to the next, not enough difference to make a difference. So it looks like when you have a realistic or a fair comparison, the difference between 30 carbine and 357 Magnum just isn't much. However, as I've said so many times, all of these are just numbers on a page. How will this translate into effectiveness on the intended target? Let's put that to the test. To evaluate the effectiveness of our ammunition on the intended target, we're going to use the meat target. And for those who haven't seen it before, the meat target is leather couch skin, followed by pork steak pectorals, pork ribs, bag of oranges to simulate lung tissue, more pork ribs on the back, 4 layers of t-shirt on the front, 4 layers on the back, and the whole thing followed by the new and improved high-tech fleece bullet stop. And I'm going to shoot this from a distance of 7 yards with my 30 carbine pistol, which is loaded with the Hornady Critical Defense 30 carbine 110 grain FTX projectile, like a ballistic tip. With our 30 carbine FTX projectiles, we see that our pork steak pectoral just has 30 caliber holes in it. Our ribs on the front of the target, where projectiles hit ribs, shattered them. We have some pretty good damage to our orange lung tissue, and as far as our ribs on the back of the target, where projectiles hit ribs, broke them. As far as penetration, 2 of our projectiles were stopped by the first layer of fleece behind the target. 1 of those projectiles made it through to about the 12th layer of fleece. But let's take a close-up look at what these projectiles look like now. And here's our 3 projectiles. 1 expanded pretty well and lost its jacket. 1 has what I'd call mediocre expansion. The other has very poor expansion. Now we have a new meat target set up, and I'll shoot this from 7 yards with Hornady Critical Defense 357 Magnum 125 grain FTX projectile, like a ballistic tip. We have to take a moment to readjust our target. Now let's shoot one more shot. With our 357 Magnum FTX projectiles, the first thing we see is that it kind of mangled our pork chop pectoral. We also see that it did a lot more damage to the ribs on the front of the target. Now, as far as our orange lung tissue, the damage with the 357 looks similar to what we got with the 30 carbine, maybe a little more. And our ribs on the back of the target have bigger holes, and again, where projectiles hit ribs broke them, but it just looks like it did more damage than the 30 carbine did. But now let's take a close-up look at these 357 projectiles. And with our 357, we have a couple of them that lost their jacket, and we just see a lot more expansion. Now we have a new meat target set up, and I'll shoot this from 7 yards with our Remington green and yellow box 30 carbine 110 grain soft point. With our Remington 30 carbine 110 grain soft point ammunition, we see that with our pork steak pectoral, just put 30 caliber holes in it. Our ribs on the front of the target, just put 30 caliber holes in them, except where the projectiles hit the ribs, shattered them. Really what I'd call mediocre, rather poor damage to our orange lung tissue. And our ribs on the back of the target, again, where projectiles hit the ribs, shattered them. Now, as far as penetration, one of our bullets was stopped by about the 20th layer of fleece. The other 2 bullets went completely through all 48 layers of fleece, and I was unable to recover them. But let's take a close-up look at the one bullet that I did recover. Here's our one bullet, and you can see that it lost its jacket. You can also see that it has virtually no expansion. We shot our last meat target with our 30 carbine soft point ammunition, so now we have a new meat target set up, and I'll shoot this from 7 yards with Remington green and white box 357 Magnum 125 grain soft point. This will be about the most realistic comparison to the 30 carbine soft point I can come up with. However, in this case, I'm only going to shoot 2 rounds because I only have 2 rounds left of this ammo. Our 357 Magnum soft points did a lot of damage to the ribs on the front of the target, and where projectiles hit ribs, shattered them. They also just mangled our orange lung tissue. And our ribs on the back of the target, they have 357 holes in them, and in this case, neither of the projectiles hit a rib. Now, one of those projectiles was stopped by the first layer of fleece. The other one made it through to the 15th layer of fleece. But let's take a close-up look at these projectiles. And both of these soft point projectiles have very good and very uniformed expansion. Today we're focusing mainly on comparing the power and effectiveness of these 2 rounds. Because our guns are virtually identical, because my felt recoil is virtually identical, I'm not going to spend much time comparing the accuracy of them. However, there is one thing I want to discuss when it comes to accuracy, and these 2 targets will help me illustrate the point. Let me show you something. Now what's up with these 2 groups? Okay, first of all, this is me shooting offhand from 20 yards with this Ruger Blackhawk 357 Magnum with a 7.5-inch barrel. And my first group, I was shooting at the target on your left, even though the first shot hit the target on your right. And the rest of the group was at best mediocre. Now, when I have a shot that's that far off, I'll usually stand here and tell you that was a flyer, that was just me. In this case, I really don't think it was. Now, the second group that I was shooting the target on your right, except for that one shot, of course, is a much better group. Now, this low shot, that was a flyer, and that was just me. So what's the difference between these two groups? Okay, the difference is that I was shooting at the target on your left with Remington green and yellow box 357 Magnum 110 grain semi-jacketed hollow point. I was shooting the group on your right with Remington green and yellow box 357 Magnum 158 grain semi-jacketed hollow point. Now, 30 carbine ammunition is pretty much all 110 grain. 357 Magnum, there's a wide variety of projectile weights. But with some 357 ammo in some 357 guns, when you start getting down to 110 grain projectiles, they can get some really high velocities, and sometimes they can become erratic. And you got to be aware of that. Now, a couple more things to add. First, this is an earplug case, or earplugs with every shot I take. When I'm going to do quite a bit of firing with calibers that are really high pressure, sometimes I wear earplugs and earphones. Also, when I'm shooting anything with a potential for blowback, like cinder blocks, steel plates, or the meat target, yes, I do wear safety glasses. I just typically take them off before I get back on camera. Okay, that having been said, also, please bear with the wind. We got a nor'wester going to blow in a few minutes. But what are the real takeaways from today? We saw that when we made what I would consider a fair and or realistic comparison between 30 carbine and 357 Magnum, ballistically on paper, they were pretty close. But when we shot the meat target, at least in my analysis of it, it appeared that 357 Magnum was the clear winner by a significant margin. And that brings up the question, why? And the best way I can explain it is that on previous occasions, we've shot that Remington green and yellow box 110 grain soft point 30 carbine ammunition and the Hornady critical defense 110 grain FTX projectile 30 carbine ammunition out of an M1 carbine with very good results. But with the rifle, when I chronographed that Remington 110 grain soft point ammunition, the velocity I got was 1,987. Today, that same ammunition out of the revolver gave us 1,551, a loss of over 400 feet per second. Now, we know that hollow points and other types of expanding projectiles are typically velocity-based. The faster you propel them, the more expansion you'll get, up to a point. And when that ammunition is manufactured in caliber 30 US carbine, the manufacturer does so with a mindset that you're most likely going to shoot that ammunition out of an 18-inch barreled firearm. And it's made to expand at those velocities, not the greatly reduced velocities that you get in a handgun. If they made that ammo to give sufficient expansion at handgun velocities, then when you shot it out of the rifle, you'd get hyper expansion and insufficient penetration. And I think that's what we're seeing here. So what we can really take away from this is, a lot of people like to carry a rifle and a handgun of the same caliber. And if you're that kind of person and your rifle is something in caliber 30 US carbine, then maybe a 30 carbine handgun is the right handgun for you. But if you want to get more effectiveness, as we clearly saw, despite what we see on paper, the 357 Magnum in a handgun is going to be more effective. So as always, don't try this at home on what you call a professional, and thanks for watching the 30 carbine versus 357 Magnum in handguns video.